Greetings. I am ready to start our next video on investments. I am a little afraid about starting it. It perhaps is one of the more complicated subjects for us to wrestle to the ground in the Sun Plus world, partially because we have a lot of changes that need to be made in the area, partially because there's dynamics going on that have nothing to do with Sun Plus about accounting for investments. Ever since organizations like Enron and so forth have failed, and it was all about classification of investments. Everyone is a little sensitive about this area. So GCAS is working hard on coming up with exactly their approach to investments, and we're trying to play catch up, and everyone is involved with that. The new financial statements that comply with the accounting manual, in general, all of our videos showed a lot of Q&A and discussions about what needed to be done over in the Q&A section of the Sun Plus world. But the problem with investments is that we are to follow the accounting manual, we are going to have to make changes in the underlying way we do the bookkeeping. So everything else we saw to comply with the accounting manual, you might say that the day-to-day bookkeeping was already being done with the accounting manual, and we just needed new financial statements to capture the routine that already existed. But that is not true with investments. With investments, we are in a world where we have to change the underlying bookkeeping. Now, what we are going to go over here is going to be slightly repetitive or seriously repetitive with what we went over in the investments video on the accounting manual. It won't hurt you to hear it twice. It will help clarify your thinking, reinforce what you already know. And then there are a few of you who haven't watched the video on investments over in the accounting manual videos, and so this will be news for you. Okay, in the process of making these new financial statements, I really hit a stone wall in handling investments. Even me understanding them correctly was a struggle. So we had several meetings with Dan Herzl, and from that, who is a technical director of GCAS, really making sure we understand the investment world correctly. And I for sure had many misunderstandings, and I bet you that you do too. The result is this document that I'm about to go through entitled Investments. This document will be attached to this video and will guide, really is the instructions. I'm going to go through it and try not to read every word off of it, but try to go through it with you. But probably you will need to download this document and study it out and read it and ask questions of me and so forth until we are very clear on using it. And I'm positive there are problems and coding problems in the Q&A sheet, and problems with our understanding, and transitional problems that we all as a Sun Plus family will have to hammer through together to get the investments showing up properly. The starting point is to make sure that we have a clear definition of what an investment is. Now, I know that you are clear on the big concept of investments, but the new thing for me was that every investment event is a separate investment. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started as we work through this document. Okay, the first concept that we need to cover is that an investment is a single investment event. Okay, so if on Monday I buy 20 shares of Microsoft stock and the next day I buy 10 more shares, those are separate investment events. So they are separate investments. Whenever you hear the implications of this will become clear, and why we have to keep them separate will become clear in a minute. but each one of those purchases are separate, which means we have to be able to report that each investment, the gain or loss on that investment, bringing it to the current market value. So the adjustment from cost to market value will be separate and different for each investment. So the stocks I bought on Monday will have to be accounted for separately, their gain recognized separately, and the adjustment to market value kept separate. Okay, and so in the past I've always sort of aggregated, put them together, and come to find out that that is not okay. Another point that was sort of news for me was that investments that are held by broker, that is not one investment account. So if you have an account with Merrill Lynch and you've got a bunch of stocks in there, they are separate investments. Every time Merrill Lynch buys stocks for you, so if they buy stocks for you on Monday and then a General Motors stock on Monday, and on Tuesday they buy General Motors stock, that is two separate investments. There's actually nothing about it being held by a broker that changes it than if you held them yourself. Okay, and then the third thing that I struggled with is this paragraph out of the accounting manual that says the accounting structure should be in place that separate investments by here's a list, by type of investment, by fund, whether they're current and non-current, and then this next sentence gives one more category, is accounting groups to help you determine their value. Okay, so that would be 4 different categories. It's a little hard to see from the way it's written, but the type of instrument, by fund, by current and non-current, and by accounting groups. So our accounting system has to address all 4 of those categories. Well, we are clear, we're okay on fund. All of us are understanding current and non-current. Okay, so the ones that leave us some discussion is accounting groups and by type of investments. Okay, so we have these 4 categories, these 4 dimensions of which we've got to keep track, our 4 types of ways of looking at our investments. We have the type of investment, fund, current, non-current, and valuation class. And we are very accustomed to handling B and C. We have good standards with B of different funds and how to do it by fund, and by current and non-current. We all understand those concepts well. That leads us to need to discuss valuation class and type of investment. Well, valuation class we can handle fairly rapidly, and type of investment is going to be more engaging with us. So I'd like, if it's okay with you, to go down to valuation class first and deal with it. The accounting manual provides for 4 different valuation classes. So we're looking right into the accounting manual now. This is the paragraph I just quoted to you, saying we have to do it by type, fund, current, non-current, and then by accounting groups for valuation. Okay, and we're calling them valuation classes. All right, and here are the 4 valuation classes. We have subject to accounting at fair value, held to maturity, loans receivable, and available for sale. Now, from a SunPlus world, this is not a very complicated problem. From an accounting, but according to the accounting manual, it may be a bigger problem, but as far as what we have to do on the system side is fairly straightforward. First off, we can handle class 3 fairly rapidly. Class 3 is loans receivable. We have segmented out loans receivable into its own accounts, and so if it's loan receivable, it belongs in those loan receivable accounts, and so we don't really put it into the investment area as far as valuation is concerned. Okay, and so that is loans receivable. That leaves the possibility that our normal investments, according in the SunPlus world, are put in class 1, 2, and 4. Well, with discussions with the auditors and them explaining this to me, 2 and 4 bypass the income statement and are adjusted directly against the net asset section. I'm not speaking that authoritatively, but in general, the best way for me to explain this is that the auditors have told us they want us to force everyone into Class 1, subject to accounting for fair value. That is, we set up the system so the default is Class 1. And then if the client, the organization, wants to build an argument that it belongs in Class 2 and Class 4, then they will need to do that. We are not going to work hard at accommodating those that want to classify their investments as Class 2 or 4. It doesn't mean that you can't do it, but the system needs to sort of shove everybody into Class 1. With that sort of background, so then we're okay. We're basically saying that all of the investments that we encounter in the SunPlus world as far as accounting system is concerned is Class 1. If someone wants to account for their assets and put them in Class 2 and 4, then our system doesn't need to accommodate it. They need to just make entries and export to Excel and reclassify and override our normal system. I don't believe we have too many people, or really, I don't believe we have anybody really using Class 2 and Class 4 investments. Okay, so that sort of takes care of this valuation by class. I mean, breaking it into class, valuation class. It's either going to be Class 3, which we put into separate accounts, or we're assuming it's a Class 1 as far as system design and accommodating most of the organizations in the world church. So what that does now is leave us with the need of discussing investment type, okay? The type of investment. Now, by type of investment, okay, we mean risk type. Now that term risk type is, I think, something I started using. Risk type means that we want to disclose to our users the type of investment, and when you talk about the type of investment, the only meaningful way to break it up is by the types of risk associated with the investment. So here is a short example just to get you thinking in the right vein. State government bonds, federal government bonds, stocks, debt securities, etc. Okay? That gives you an idea. Well, the risk of a government bond is different than the risk of a stock, which is different than a debt security. In discussing this with the auditors, they suggested a more complex model, and this is where I have to be extremely careful, because these risk types have to do with the risk faced by the organization. We cannot produce a risk types that are standard for every organization. So this is just a sample which has a strong U.S. bias. Okay? All right, so for example, you could have equity securities large cap, small cap, equity securities international, debt securities federal, state, local, corporate, mutual funds equity that are mostly equity, mutual funds equity focused on a certain group, like a certain pharmaceuticals, mutual funds which are mostly debt securities, mutual funds that are focused on a particular industry, and then the GC different funds. These are just an example. In Thailand, we may have equity securities Thai, equity securities small cap Thailand, equity securities small cap US, and so forth. So it's very important for you to understand that these are examples, and you would need to provide for the different groupings of your investments that grouped in a way they make sense for your organization. Okay? Don't automatically just grab these and go with them. Okay, so this is going to change the way we do accounting. All right, now one thing I'd like to mention, and so that we don't have any misunderstanding about this and arguments with the auditors and so forth. One thing that we have always sort of assumed in the SunPlus world that is changing with this presentation is that for the really important stuff, we needed to have separate accounts. Okay, that was what we used to preach. So if that somehow or another the auditors are happy with the important things when we kept separate accounts. So it'd be okay to have dimensional accounting on departments, but salary expense needed to be its own account. You wouldn't want to do that with dimensional accounting. All right, well, in discussion, this is with the highest level folks in GCAS. They realize that we are not going to set up an account for every single investment. Okay, so I'm going to show you the accounts we're going to set up, but it's going to use dimensional accounting to keep the details of each investment. So we buy General Motors stock on Monday, and we buy General Motors stock on Tuesday. Those are two separate investments. We're not going to keep those into two separate accounts. We'll have just a minimal number of accounts, and we're going to use dimensional accounting to keep the separate investments separate. I hope that makes sense. So this is sort of a new age for us to think about, a new way of looking at it. Maybe new age is not the right term, but this a new way of looking at it, that the auditors are becoming more comfortable with dimensional accounting, where we don't have to keep every bit of details into separate accounts. Okay, we can use dimensional, as long as we can break it out by dimensions. They are becoming more and more satisfied that is fair accounting. Okay, so we are going to set up 7 accounts. Okay, 7 accounts, and all of our investment accounting is done in those 7 accounts. So let's just go through them and get the list on the table. The first list will be accounts that start with 110. And it will be 110 USD if the investment is in US dollars, 110 EUR if the investment is in euros. It would be 110 THB if they are in Thai bahts. Whatever the currency of the investment, okay, is the name of the number of the account. So 110 is the cost of the investment. Okay, we're going to keep the investments in a short-term account that starts with 110. That is the original cost, goes into 110. Okay, and then while we are at it, okay, let's look down here at 119. Okay, and it's a little bit jumping around. Okay, 110 is the original cost of the investment, and 119, you can see they're lining up together. So US dollar 110 is the original cost of the investment, and 119 is the allowance for recognized change. Okay, if you paid $100 for a US dollar investment, it would go into 110 at $100, and then if the market value went up 10, okay, it went up to 110, the value of the stock or whatever, then the $10 increase in value would go into 119 USD. So this, the 110 account plus the 119 account, comes up to the current market value of the investment. And it could also be going down. Okay, so if you paid $100 and it went down to 90, okay, so the $100 goes into 110 as a debit, and the 119 gets a credit for 10 to bring it down to its 90. Okay, so 110 and 119 combined gives you the market value of your investments. Okay, then account number 112 and 118 is how we move things from being short-term to long-term. We're keeping the investments in a short-term account 110, but if all the investments go in there, whether they're short-term or long-term, they go into 110. And then to straighten out the long-term, short-term problem, we'll use a contra account in 112 to reduce the short-term, and we'll use an account 118 that will move it, so to speak, from being short-term to long-term. Okay, I will illustrate that in a minute. But the balance of your 112s and your 118s are always the same number. Okay, the amount that belongs over in long term. Okay, so 112 in essence takes it out of short term, and 118 takes what was taken out of short term and puts it into long term. So the whole market value of the stock is in 110, 119, whether it's short term or long term, and then 112 and 118 takes the short term and reduces it and puts it into long term. Okay, so with all that discussion, we have, let's count them. 110 is 1, 112 is 2, 118 is 3, and 119 is 4. Okay, I said there's 7. So let's go ahead and look at the others. Okay, and then we have 3 more accounts. Unrealized gain or loss, which is in the revenue section of the financial statements. And it's in the revenue section whether it has a debit or a credit balance. And we have unrealized gain or loss. And so that account 715 is used in tandem with account 119 to get it to its market value. Okay, unrealized gain or loss. The realized gain or loss, which I will explain in a minute, is 712. Okay, and 712 is in the revenue section as well, even if it has a debit balance. If it's a loss, it still goes in the revenue section. And then finally we have investment income, which is 711. Okay, so those are the accounts that are set up for investments. Those 7 accounts. Okay, run through them again. No more, no less. You need all of these to do investments. 110, 112, 118, 119, 715, 712, and 711. Okay. Every one of those 7 accounts need to be set up with the MOP setting when you create the account, requiring details. Okay, details are mandatory in our system. Okay, so we need to have, every time you make an entry to any of these accounts, you also have to populate it with details. And the note right here just emphasizes what I've already said, is that you would set up one of those all 7 of those accounts for each currency you have investments in. Okay, so if you have 2 currencies that you have investment in, you will end up with 14 new accounts, all of them requiring the MOP setting. All right, and then we'll move right along, and the MOP setting for details. That's the 10th analysis dimension in Sun Plus. Over in details, okay, we are going to set up, and I'm going to expand this a little bit, so don't let this startle you, so you can read this. I know it's hard to read over the screen, but I want to show you how to set up your details dimension. All right, and so I'm going to expand this, see what happens. Whoa, that's big. Okay, but I think I might just keep it. Okay, all right, first off, what we're going to do is set up analysis dimension starting with 11. The code will be 11. All right, to help us keep details separate from other details. So if we're using the details dimension to account for buildings or automobiles or work in process, we don't want to get everything confused. And so we are going to use 11 as a prefix for any of our, this illustrates it well, for all of our investments we'll start with 11 so we can keep them separate from the B's, or from the I's used for other purposes. The work in processes all start with W. So we're starting with 11 to get off on our own dimension situation. Okay, and then now, if you recall, I said that we need, excuse me for jumping around here, that we are going to determine our investment categories. Okay, our risk categories. All right, they're coming. Okay, here they are. We are going to set up our risk categories. You could see them going by here. GCAS's illustration. All right, before we have gotten to where we are in this project, we have determined the risk categories for our organization. Okay, I'm sorry. All right. So before we have gotten over in the details section, we have determined the list that is applicable for our organization. I apologize for jumping around so much, but so in conference with the CFO and with anyone else, call me and talk to me about it if you want. You need to establish the types of investments that are relevant to your organization. It could be something that looks like this, but it would be different depending on your location in your organization. Okay, you establish this list before you open the details dimension. Then you go over and you open the details dimension and you set up that list in the details dimension. Let me show it to you. Okay, all right, it's coming. All right, brother. All right, there. So we set this up, and the details, and you could see that this account, this heading 1101 is investment cash. It matches my risk category that I had over on the other page, and you could see a 1110 equity securities. Okay, 1111 ES large cap, equity securities large cap. And then you could see, let's see, I think probably looking down here, you can see it the best. You can see each of my categories, risk types, are established. Each of my risk types are established in caps, and I've prohibited posting to these headings. So just like we have headings in our chart of accounts as being accounts that we don't post to, we're doing the same sort of thing here. Okay, and so each of these major headings are put into details, okay, from my list of risk categories, and I prohibit posting to those details. Okay, when I set them up, I set them up as headings, and do that by putting them in caps and prohibiting posting. Then every time I have a new investment, I will create under its proper heading the particular investment description. So here's a real good example. On April 14th of 2008, I bought 100 shares of Microsoft stock, and May 14th of 2009, I bought 200 shares of Microsoft stock. Those are two separate investments, okay? And they're put into details separately. Okay, I think you could probably see which way this is heading. This means that every time when I bought the stock and debited my account at cost for when I made this purchase, I will come over and click and code the details for that purchase right here with this stock. Then later on, when the value changes and I record the change in value, I will record the entry. We're going to look at the entries in a minute. I'll tag it with this one. Okay, every entry has to be tagged with what stock you're talking about or what investment you're talking about. The accounting manual and IFRS and US GAAP and everybody involved says you have to keep track of the cost of your investment, individual purchase. Okay, you have to keep track of your cost of investment. These are two separate investments. And then you have to mark it to its market value. Well, in order to do that, you have to be able to keep it separate. Okay, when you look at the market value of these two stocks, they'll have the same market value, but the appreciation is going to be different. Okay, so in the end of 2014, these two have the same market value, but the amount of appreciation that needs to be booked, the amount of increase in value that needs to be booked is going to be different because these had different costs. So you got to just keep everything separate and tag everything with the stock that was involved. Okay, and so there you could see the way we set it. Every time you purchase an investment, you have to go over to details, create a detailed code, okay, an analysis code in details for that investment, and you have to tag every entry you make relative to that investment has to be tagged with that investment. Okay. Now, I know it's sort of complicated. I do not mind that you just say, man, this is painful. That's a perfectly reasonable emotion. This is just a painful process. But if you've got a better way of doing it, I will be happy to hear about it. Okay? All right, but you have to keep every investment separate and the gain and loss on every investment separate, the appreciation and value kept separate. Okay? All right, so this instructions here tell you what I just explained to you about how to set up the analysis dimension details for the investments. Now we have to go through some example entries. All right, this is actually very simple, and don't worry, these sample entries are almost exactly the same as in the accounting manual. So but actually, to my mind, sort of simplified or clearer than the accounting manual. And so let's look at it. All right, an investment purchase, whether current or non-current, are recorded in account 110, just like I said. So for a US dollar investment, the entry to purchase $1,000 in General Motors stock on April 12th is a debit to this account 110, investment in US dollars, and credit Citibank as we paid $1,000 for this stock. That would be coded to the particular investment. That is, we would have to, when we made this purchase, before we made this entry, we'd have to go over to details and set up the particular stock that we purchased, and you're going to have to put the date on it so you can keep it separate from other. So in your descriptions, you can't just say General Motors stock, because later on you buy more General Motors stock and you'll get confused about which General Motors stock you're talking about. So here we've set up the code 111GM01 for General Motors, and the description is General Motors shares purchased 12 April 2013. Okay, and so this entry here is tagged with that details code, and all other entries will be tagged with that code. So I won't keep saying it, or I probably will end up saying it because, but because I can't hardly help myself, but you get the idea. All right, so we'll debit investment in US dollars, and we'll tag it that it was General Motors stock bought on April the 12th. Okay, then later on we get a dividend of $50. We'll debit Citibank for $50. We'll credit account 711 US dollar investment income for $50, and we'll tag that with the General Motors G111 GM01. Okay, and so we go ahead, and so at the end of the year we have a book value of this stock for $1,000. Okay, and at the end of the year it's worth $1,100. And also, to make it keep life interested, let's just say that we decided that it is non-current. Okay, and so you say, well, how could it be non-current? I mean, we always sell it. Well, our intention is to not use it for operating purposes. We're saving this stock up for, say, to buy a new building or something. So our intention is also part of it. So even though we can convert it to cash, our intention is not to convert it to cash. It's not available for operations, and so it would be non-current. Okay, so we've got the go from 1,000 to 1,100, and so we'll debit account 119 USD, investment in US dollars, allowance for recognized change. We'll debit that account for 100, and we'll credit account 715 US dollars, unrealized gain for 100. Okay, all right, and then we also need to classify it as non-current. It's in account, okay, the stock right now is in account 110, and we're going to leave it in there, but to get us straightened out with non-current, we will debit investment in US dollars and credit in US dollars long-term portion contra for 1,100. Okay, that gets it out of current and puts it into non-current. Okay, so I hope that's clear. Now, this is debatable about whether this is the right way to set up, but we feel like having all of your investments in one place is the best place, and then use these accounts to get it over into long term. Okay, so this is the contra account, so we'll add the 110s and the 112s to get our total investments, and the 119s and so forth, but this will be added to our investments at the current level, and this credit will reduce our total investments because it has essentially been moved to long term. Okay, so let's say we sold it for $1,150. We'll debit Citibank for $1,150 to deposit the money we got from selling it. It's obvious we need to get the 1,000 out of the account 110, which had the original cost figure of 1,000. We need to get the 119. We need to credit that account for 100 to get it empty of the allowance that we put in right up here. Okay, we put it in here. This takes it out there. Okay, and then we have a realized gain of 50. So the difference between our carrying value when we sold it and the amount we got when we sold it becomes the realized gain. Okay, so this is usually a fairly small number because we've marked it to its market value at the end of last year. So this would just be the appreciation, increase in value during the year. And so to reiterate, we debited cash for what we got. We emptied the costs from account 110, the appreciation in value, the markup in value that we had for 100, and then we recorded an income account called realized gain for the 50. Now, it could have been very easy for us to have ended up in a situation where this 119 needed to be debited, because if we had a decline in value up here in this 119 at this entry right here, if we'd had a decline in value, the opposite of this entry would have been made. We would have debited 715 and credited 119 if we'd had a decline in value. So when we sold it, we would have had a debit here instead of a credit. Okay, I didn't make that very clear back earlier, but if instead of having an increase in value, if we'd had a decline in value, this entry would have used the exact same accounts, but the entry, the debit and credit would have been reversed. 715 would have been debited for 100 and 119 credited for a 100. So if we had a recovery of a decline in value, then we would have had a debit here, and the difference would have been made up in our realized gain. Okay, and to tidy up things, we have to get the amount that's in our long-term reversed, because this no longer need to be reclassified from short-term to long-term, so we just simply reverse what we put into long-term earlier. We simply just have to reverse that entry there, since we no longer have the asset. So we shouldn't be providing for the long-term portion of that asset, if that makes any sense. Okay, and the key to all of this is that you could study these entries out, and the key is that all of them have to be tagged with the individual investment that you're talking about. And then finally, just for a second here, let's look at the way this shows up on the financial statements. Okay, we are going to have financial statements that categorize the things according to these labels here, match the risk grouping that you have for your organization. This is not prescribed. Each of these headings are not prescribed by the accounting manual. They're prescribed by your situation, which means you will have to modify the standard financial statements, which I'm going to show you how in just a second, to reflect your particular risk group. Okay? So you will want each of your risk groups to get thrown into the right category. Their cost coming from account 110, their currency coming from here. This will come up with the name of the currency, like US dollars. Their cost coming in here. Their fair value, which is not kept. The fair value in total is not kept in the accounting system. What we're keeping in the accounting system is the fair value, the cost, and the increase and decline in value. So the cost plus the increase and decline in value gives you your fair value. So the logic of the financial statements is a little bit different than the actual way we keep the data. It looks like we're keeping track of costs, we're keeping track of fair value, and the difference between these are increase and decrease. But in fact, we're keeping track of cost, we're keeping track of increase and decrease, and then we modify costs by the increase and decrease to give us our fair value. And then finally, we're keeping track of earnings. Okay, so now we are able to show cost, fair value, and the amount we lost or gained, and the amount of earnings on each of our investments. If you have not set up this according to instructions, any amount in these investment accounts appear right here. Okay, they appear right here under a heading called Investments Needing Detailed Work by Accountants. What this means is that you have put entries in the investment accounts, but you haven't given it the information in it. You haven't set up the detailed analysis codes that allow it to be put up here in this section, which means that it throws it in here. It's got to go somewhere. So what your goal is to get this account separate, this row empty, by giving it the detail coding that throws it up into the top, and then when you've got this completely empty, this row will disappear. Okay, and that would include for this year and last year. Then this breaks it down to what are the totals for each of the different funds. Okay, so this amount needing work by accountants is here, as well as if you haven't gotten it into the proper fund, it will show up there. Okay, Now to get it to, you could see here from the summary link that is populating these cells, any of these cells right here, okay, this is the summary link that populates it. And so what it's doing is looking in column I and J to get the details coding to put it in the right column. Okay, so over here, unseen, okay, right over here to the right in the Q&A, is the details code that you have used to make it show up in that row. So you may change this row to be something like Thai baht or local country investments, and whatever details codes you set up to categorize your asset, your investment that way, you would put in columns I and J over here. These cells automatically look for investments that match the I and J columns and will kick the value over to where it belongs. And so this is sort of illustrating it here. So you have large cap, you would change this to match your description of your coding, okay, and you would change this to to match your description, and then this sheet will be ready to go. Okay, and this explains that whole process. Now, one of the big challenges of this is how do you get, is fairly simple, I think, to understand what I've been describing. For knowledgeable accountants, I think it's fairly simple to understand what I've been describing after you study it out. What's going to take some reflection is how do I transition to these new system? One way to do it is on a quiet Sunday afternoon where no one else is working. I would go to you could go to your system, open up all of the periods you've ever had, go to your investment accounts and write reclassifying entries that move things into the new accounts and your new details, as if you've been following this system all along. Okay, this will make the auditors nervous, but you're not changing total investments. Your total investments will be exactly the same, okay, under this system and what you've been doing in the past. Okay, but now you've got the details. And so one possibility is just to open up those past periods. It makes you a little nervous about doing that. And the beauty is that your comparative financial statements will be fine then. If that scares you, another way to do it, which probably is a little bit more safe, is to go into the current period, whatever current periods you have, and go into your investment accounts and reclassify them and code them by details as of today. Okay? It's not going to be a perfect solution, but what that would do is take care of your current year. Okay? It would take care of your current year. Right here, this is the current year figures, but it would not take care of your last year. So your current year page would look good, and for a year, your previous year page would not look good. And that just may be okay as a transition. Just carefully moving to the new system by going ahead and writing entries right now to get all of your investments over to those accounts that we've described in this presentation, setting up details for all of your investments and getting them coded correctly in those entries, and just use that from here on out. And sooner or later all the old stuff will drop off in time past from the financial statements. And so over time, all of your accounts, all of your financial statements will start looking good. So I guess if you really feel comfortable about what you're doing, you could do alternative 1, and that would have the advantage of making your financial statements look good right now. all this year and last year. And the other is a step 2, which would keep last year looking bad, but sooner or later this year will be move in the last year column and you will be fine. Investment section. Okay, so let's open up the statements and take a peek at these investment pages down here just to make sure that you can see it. Okay, so you will go through and change these headings to match your risk category and change these coding over here to match your coding for those risk categories for your investments. One idea, of course, would be to keep my coding and just change the name of them. Okay, and that would get you along pretty well, and you don't really need to change anything in here. Now, everything that I've described to you, and make sure you're clear on it, nothing I described to you changes what is showing up in your investments and on the balance sheet. Okay, so these investments that are showing up on your balance sheet are the same under the new and the old system. The difference is that an accounting manual requires for you to have this note page that shows each of the types of investments, you know, each of the risk categories, the currents, the cost, the fair value, and the unrealized increase and decrease. The accounting manual, in fact, requires these 3 categories. The accounting manual doesn't necessarily require currency, except for I think it's so easy. And it seems to me also valuable once we've got everything in place to talk about the fair value of the asset. Well, why don't we keep track of how much we made on the investments as well, since it's right there. Okay, so that concludes our presentation of investment. I know that there's a lot of discussion about this and a lot of problems, and I will be happy to discuss this with you and including meet with you on exactly how to set this up. And for you that are big organizations that have a lot of investment, I'll be happy to help you make that change. So thank you, and our next video, this is actually really the end of our official videos on the new financial statements, and thank you for listening.